G7 is supposed to lead the world. After all, it is composed of the 7 richest countries, yet their policies are proving otherwise. From the proposed tax law to their summit recently, which demonized China on a host of issues. Hello and welcome. I'm Kavita Wei. Coming up in today's program, the G7 summit slamming China's economic prowess, containing China to be the goal. But they also say they welcome competition. What kind of welcoming is that when they sanction and restrict Chinese companies? Well, when it comes to China, it's not having it. They have countered by first saying that a small group of countries does not rule the world. China also introduced a new anti-foreign sanctions policy, companies to be put on a blacklist. Can you guess which countries they are? And then finally, the G7 has proposed a tax reform on the world stage, a U.S. proposed global corporate tax rate for the first time. But how can the U.S. propose this when U.S. companies are not paying their fair share of taxes?
How's that? Okay, you're right. Can you hear me, everybody? Can I begin by welcoming everybody to Carbis Bay?
It's the same old scene, but with different players. Finance ministers and central bankers from the G7 economic powers getting together to discuss the global economy. Some topics from the past have been the faltering global recovery, debt crises, and stability in the banking sector. Yet not much headway has been made, like in the case of world debt. If one was to ask how much debt has been accumulated over the past decade, the figures would be shocking. $281 trillion is the current world debt. Out of that, the U.S. added about $9 trillion of debt over the past decade. And this year, what appears to be a U.S. push, China has become enemy number one, along with Russia. This is while the U.S. government is incapable or unwilling to protect American citizens from its own police force. And yet, it is planning to spend hundreds of billions in tax dollars to confront China. The Innovation and Competition Act 2021 will spend $250 billion on the rivalry with China.
G7 communique was a straight attack on China, minus the military hardware. China did not deserve to be downgraded this way. Of course, China did retaliate. Now, the view held by the U.S. and China was that it represented a significant challenge to the world's democracies. It was reported that the leaders agreed the need for a common agenda in addressing China, including elements where they would stand up and counter and compete.
I think we're in a contest, not with China per se, but a contest with autocratic governments around the world, as to whether or not democracies can compete with them in the rapidly changing 21st century. And I think how we act and whether we pull together as democracies is going to determine whether our grandkids look back 15 years from now and say, did they step up?
Well, China's response to this unfounded accusation stood in stark contrast to the G7 countries, in particular the U.S.
我想强调，世界多极化、国际关系民主化是不可抗拒的时代潮流。一国或一个国家集团号令天下的时代已经过去了。
It's time now to bring our first guest to the program. He is none other than Justin Stewart. He is the ambassador at 7 Investment Management, which he founded. He is also an investment manager and business commentator who has appeared on numerous TV outlets. Well, Justin, welcome. The leading world countries, which are comprised of the G7, came up with an anti-China stance. They said because China has become an economic powerhouse to rival the U.S. and possibly, of course, set to be moving into the #1 economy in the world, that spot, that it's going to pose a security threat. How is it possible to actually, for them to draw that conclusion?
It's going to be fascinating to see how this plays out now, because what you've got is a G7 group of countries who are suffering from a bout of severe insecurity. Insecurity against, well, not just China, but also Russia as well. And following, obviously, the dreadful regime that we had under President Trump, which destroyed a lot of the trust between those members.
Indeed, we can't forget that. Thank you so much for that. We appreciate it. That's Justin there. We are headed for a quick break now here on Economic Divide. And what better way to do that than to actually see some fantastic images of protests that happened during the G7 summit, which was held in UK's Cornwall, where the protesters actually devised some really creative ways to bring their message across, including a fabulous display by Greenpeace, which involved drones. Take a look.
Invited my friend, you invite me. My friend there.
Oh, sorry, I'm breaking your life.
World leaders have committed to being carbon neutral by 2050. That's too late. It's like rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic.
Oh, yes.
Since the Paris summit, carbon emissions actually gone up. So, carbon emissions have gone up. I'm a grandmother. I'm desperately trying to make sure that there's a future.
Once upon a time, our world leaders gathered in Cornwall to decide our future. I hope it's not too late.
So Greenpeace is here with a very simple, clear message, which is act now to the leaders of the G7. They need to step up and actually deliver on their promises for the climate and nature emergency.
I want our leaders to do their jobs and fight for the planet. Hope comes from action, not words.
It's time now for our in-depth section. Let's dig deep into the G7 to find out its relevance and areas of focus. Now, in terms of the group itself, it's an organization of the world's 7 largest so-called advanced economies. They are in no particular order. The UK, France, Canada, you have the United States, Japan, Italy, and rounding off the list, Germany. Now notice how China and Russia are not in this grouping. Well, China has never been a member, despite having one of the largest economies in the world, soon to take over the US. But its low level of wealth per person means that it is not seen as an advanced economy in the way that other G7 members are. Now, Russia was thrown out of the G7 back in the year 2014, and the reason for that, well, is because of its annexation of Crimea, which is still hurting it. Russia was actually part of a grouping called the G8. And at this point, well, it has not been permitted back into the group. Now, is the G7 all that it is cracked up to be in terms of it consisting of the 7 most advanced economies in the world? Although that could be up for discussion, you can't deny the hard facts. Looking at the gross domestic product for the year 2019, it comes in at 31.68% of the global economy. The G20 countries, which exclude G7, the G20 that is, they have 41.51% share of the global GDP. Note how the G7 number is going down, however, based on projections for the year 2025, coming in at, again, a projection at 28.8%, its share of the global GDP for that year. Now, the goals of this year's G7 summit in the UK is kind of similar to the previous ones. For example, looking at the coronavirus, this is not the same. Obviously, this is new. The coronavirus global recovery is something that was an area of focus. Promoting free and fair trade, that's been a continuing theme. Looking at climate change, tackling that obviously a big priority, as they have said every year when they have the summit. And finally, one of the things, global shared values, another one that's actually been a theme of previous summits, and one that was much touted about recently is the fair taxation, which we're going to get into later. Well, here's UK's finance minister, who has spelled out the terms or the theme of and objectives of the G7 to the finance ministers of the G7 countries.
Morning. Delighted to welcome today G7 finance ministers to the UK. It's the first time we've met in person in 2 years, and I believe we can make significant progress in tackling some of the world's most pressing economic challenges. Firstly, providing support to vulnerable countries through coronavirus. Secondly, making sure that we meet our ambitions on net zero and tackling climate change. And thirdly, ensuring that the way we tax large, global, especially digital companies is fair and fit for the modern age. I'm confident we can make progress on all these fronts. Thank you.
Well, these goals are a repeat from previous summits. There's nothing new about them except for the coronavirus pandemic, of course. Now, how close has the G7 then come to its current and to its previous goals? Well, let's take a look at, for example, climate change. This is a stark reality. The G7 nations spending more on fossil fuels than green energy. Public money committed to forms of energy in G7 countries, and it's from the year 2020 through 2021, January through March of the current year. Look at the stark reality here. They have spent $189 billion on fossil fuels. And when you compare that to clean energy, the clean energy money that they have spent, $147 billion on clean energy there. Well, let's take a look at another issue here that comes into display. Again, displaying a double standard when it comes to G7 countries. These are the top 4 companies out of the 20 that have contributed to the CO2 emissions. In this case, you're looking at 480 billion tons of carbon dioxide that have been emitted since 1965. The top 4 companies, Saudi Aramco, Chevron, Gazprom, and ExxonMobil, continuously year after year to be the top 4 CO2 emitters. And of course, when you take a look at these companies, well, you have basically UK and the US as major stockholders. Well, campaigners again had to voice their opposition towards the G7 countries that they are not living up to their promises.
And we're bitterly disappointed to see the lack of action that's needed. These are 7 of the most powerful countries in the world. You know, what they do matters. And when they decide to do very little and look at spin instead of substance, to cook the books, to cook the planet, then that's just not good enough. So yes, we're really disappointed. They could have done a lot more and they failed.
We know in detail what is happening to our planet. And we know many of the things we need to do during this decade. We have the skills to address it in time. All we need is the global will to do so.
All right, Sir David Attenborough there. Well, another theme that the G7 boasts about tackling inequality, yet the world is still experiencing record inequality. Just in the year 2019, the world's 2,153 billionaires have more wealth than 4.6 billion people who make up 60% of the planet's population.
The message is loud and clear. We need to end the billionaire boom. This is a system which is built on the exploitation of women, girls, ordinary people, and planet Earth. This cannot continue. Obscene inequality needs to end.
Indeed. Let's take a look at another chart here. It's actually a comparative study which drives the point home when combining the world's rich, which come from the G7 countries, to their fossil fuel emissions. Yes, those two topics merged into one. Now, based on what you see over here, the richest 10% of the people produce half of the planet's individual consumption-based fossil fuel emissions. Now, you take that and then compare it to what we have here, the poorest 50%, which is roughly about 3.5 billion people. They only contribute 10%.
Une des conclusions de notre rapport, c'est les inégalités criantes au niveau international. Pour citer un chiffre, les 1% les plus riches ont émis 2 fois plus que la moitié la plus pauvre de la population mondiale. Donc 1%, c'est 2 fois plus que 3 milliards de personnes.
Well, there you go. Hopefully that drives the point home. So you have all of that on one side of the story that we explained. Then you have the recent G7 communique, which in a nutshell blasted China for, in part, its economic advancement. This is what they have said: China using economic might to bully others. Now, the U.S. also calls it competition. Now, China obviously is not going to have any of that. It has retaliated, cautioning the G7 that a small group of countries just does not rule the world. Now, another issue that the G7 recently proposed and got the nod from its members was the issue of taxation. It was a U.S. proposal that originated from the U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen. But how can a country that can't manage its own companies pay taxes propose a tax plan for the entire world?
The G7 has taken significant steps this weekend to end the existing harmful dynamic.
The U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen's claim to fame.
Making commitments today that provide tremendous momentum towards achieving a robust global minimum tax at a rate of at least 15%.
She's hailed an unprecedented commitment by the G7 wealthy nations to achieve a global minimum corporate tax rate of at least 15%. Rich nations have failed for years to agree to a way to raise more taxes from large multinationals like Google, Amazon, and Facebook, which often pay little or no taxes on their income. The deal could raise tens of billions of dollars from governments at a time when government coffers are empty after the coronavirus pandemic.
We want all the digital companies, all the important digital companies that are making huge profits to be in the scope of this digital taxation. Nobody could understand that at the end of the negotiation we could explain, well, there is a digital taxation, but you have some of the digital giants being included and some of the digital giants being included and the other one excluded.
Yet real commitments have not been made as of yet, raising the possibility that this may be yet another failed attempt to collect corporations that evade or don't pay their fair share of taxes.
We are discussing, as you know, on the proposal the United States made to have a minimum tax rate of 15% or more, and we are discussing on the question of how to better tax the digital corporates.
When it comes to the U.S., how can it expect this agreement to be a success when it can't even manage corporations within the U.S. to pay their fair share of taxes? In the most recent report, many Fortune 500 companies who were profitable had a total federal tax rate of 0 or less for 3 consecutive years.
In this segment, both of our guests will be featured to see what they think about our hot topic of the program, and that's China's anti-sanction law. Now, this law is designed to boost Beijing's power against international pressure. It aims to protect Chinese individuals or organizations in the event that a country uses various pretexts or its laws to take discriminatory action against them.
它的背景的话呢，它实际上是跟当前的这种形势和我们面临的任务有关。因为的话呢，某些一段时间以来啊，尤其是最近这1-2年以来，就是某些西方国家的话呢，它这种违反国际法和国际关系的基本准则，这种利用所谓的涉疆、涉港等作为借口啊。
So without further ado, let's see what our guests think about this. Justin Stewart, ambassador at 7 Investment Management, rejoins us along with Craig Holman, lobbyist at Public Citizen. Okay, Justin, first over to you. Beijing accusing Western nations, especially the U.S., of suppressing China's development, lashing out at illegal and unreasonable sanctions, as I just mentioned. And then they have this Chinese law against foreign sanctions designed to boost Beijing's power against international pressure. Do you think this is going to shield China and its interests and also its companies?
Any action by government normally to try and actually fend off against international sanctions normally doesn't tend to work very well. The only way to actually manage sanctions is to actually sit down and negotiate with those countries, whether you actually like them or not.
Craig, what do you think about what our guest Justin has said there? That China actually should sit down and talk this over with China, especially when it comes to sanctions, that ultimately, you know, this is going to backfire and negotiations is the only real way of getting these countries, like the G7 countries, to get along with China.
China has just passed a law that is the most draconian response to sanctions. If the G7 actually imposes sanctions or starts phasing out Chinese investments, they came out with a very draconian law that would, first of all, ban any foreign country that did something like that from participating in the Chinese market at all. I mean, that's not how it's done these days. I mean, these days there are sanctions. You know, we'll impose a 10% fee on importing your products as a sanction. China's law says we just won't let you come in here and join our market whatsoever. And then it goes even another step further, and it penalizes not only the companies and the countries behind those types of efforts, but even the individuals, where it would threaten arrests, harassment of individuals, of companies that are targeted. Now that is so draconian that I really don't believe China plans on carrying through with it.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to thank both Justin Stewart and Craig Holman there. Obviously, insightful statements on China and the the Chinese sanctions law that they've incorporated. So at this point, it's be a good time to actually take a look at some more of those sound bites from the protesters of the G7 summit, of which after that, I'm going to be right back with our Info News section. It's time now for our Info News section, where we take a look at other economic news from around the world to be highlighted that we've deemed to be important. First up, we're going to take a look at a piece of news that involves inequality. In this case in point, the COVID crisis to have caused wealth inequality. Nothing new about that. We've covered that before. But what caught our attention is the fact that you have a 5.2 million increase in the world millionaires to a total of 56.1 million people. So you can see how that is increasing. And the 56.1 million people, they hold 45.8% of the world's wealth. What happened to the G7 when it comes to tackling inequality, by the way? Okay, moving on to the next item, fake reviews. Yes, this is incredible. Amazon and Google are being investigated over fake reviews. Why are they having fake reviews? Well, the reason is, it turns out that the sellers on their sites are using fake reviews to improve their star ratings. And of course, people then use that as the barometer to go and buy, for example, the products from these manufacturers or factories that make these products. And this way, they eliminate competition. Next up to China, China's poverty rate. After 8 years, they've eliminated poverty in that country. And that's really a milestone. How have they been able to do that? Well, that story is very long. Obviously, initiative from the government has a lot to do with this monumental task. But the result was that 99 million rural poor were actually raised from poverty. Again, quite a feat there, and kudos to China for that. And our final look regards U.S. sanctions. This is quite incredible. You have the United States and Israel who have renewed sanctions on Cuba. U.S. has been blasted for continuing to have sanctions on Cuba for decades. However, they are the only two to have renewed sanctions on Cuba. This is while 184 nations have condemned the American blockade of this island nation. And that, of course, is something that Cuba has lost billions of dollars in trade revenues. The issues of the world today are left to be solved by the G7 rich countries in the world. That is what the premise is. But a reality check of the state of affairs in the world today paints a very different picture.
If you just look around the world, more than 30 countries are seeing protests. People are on the streets, and what are they saying? That they're not going to accept this inequality. They're not going to live with these conditions.
The G7 is not interested in really solving the problems of the world, or else it would have done so by now. When just a handful of people have as much money as the rest of the world, problems could be solved, let alone if you take the richest 7 countries to tackle that. But that is the whole point, isn't it? The rich can not only get away with it, they need to have the rest of the population be in need of them so that their superiority reigns. Don't get me wrong, G7 countries have done the world a lot of good, but the contribution has been just handouts if you look at it. They need to act now, before time runs out, especially on planet Earth. That does it for this edition of Economic Divide. Your questions and comments are always welcome. From the entire team here, it's goodbye until the next program.